On a cold January night in 1837, Catherine Brennan sat in a corner chair of a locked room inside Sweetwater Plantation, her hands shaking as she held a pen above a blank ledger page. Across from her stood her husband Nathaniel, his gray eyes hard as steel, instructing her on exactly what to write and observe. The young woman brought into the room was Ruth, only 23 years old, terrified and powerless in what was about to unfold. Catherine had no choice either. That night marked the beginning of something far darker than the everyday cruelty of slavery. A Charleston doctor with grotesque ideas about human breeding would soon become involved, followed by a circle of wealthy men who traded children like livestock. The secrets born that night would spread like rot until they consumed everyone. Before diving further into Catherine Brennan's ordeal and in the horrors of Sweetwater, remember to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit the bell, so you never miss stories like this. Drop a comment, letting us know your city or state. We love seeing where our community is listening from. What Catherine saw that night was only the first step into a world more sinister and calculated than she ever imagined. At the time, Milledgeville served as Georgia's capital, a place of red clay roads and white-columned buildings where politicians and planters smoked cigars and schemed in dim parlors. Just 20 miles northeast, where the Oconee River cut through pine forest and bottomland, Sweetwater stretched across 2,000 acres of cotton. Its main house, built in the federal style with tall windows and a balanced facade, stood on a rise that gave Nathaniel Brennan a sweeping view of his estate. He inherited Sweetwater in 1832 at the age of 28, along with 37 enslaved people, and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Standing just under 6 feet, lean and angular, with eyes said to look through rather than at you, Nathaniel never dirtied his hands with a plow. His nails were always neatly trimmed, his focus set on ledgers, agricultural journals from Charleston and Savannah, and letters exchanged with men who spoke of scientific farming and the management of both crops and people. Catherine Haywood became his wife in May 1834. She was 19, he was 30, and their marriage linked two of Central Georgia's most respected families. Her father ran a successful mercantile business in Milledgeville, and Catherine herself had been educated at a finishing school in Augusta. She could read Latin, play pianoforte, and manage household accounts with sharp precision. With auburn hair pulled back in the fashionable style, her portraits show a woman with a strong jaw and dark, intelligent eyes, handsome rather than delicate. Their first year together was peaceful by plantation standards. Catherine oversaw the household servants, arranged dinners for Nathaniel's political allies, and tended to the rhythms of Sweetwater life. The house carried the scent of beeswax and lavender in summer, wood smoke, and cinnamon in winter. Like most plantation mistresses, she kept a medicinal herb garden, learning which plants eased fever and which softened the pain of childbirth for enslaved women denied real medical care. But as time passed, her failure to produce children began to cast a shadow. In a society that measured a woman's worth by heirs, Catherine's empty cradle became the subject of whispers at church and cruel teasing from other women. Nathaniel never spoke of it outright, but Catherine could read the truth in the small details, the way his jaw tightened when friends bragged about their children, the way he would excuse himself whenever someone asked when Sweetwater would hear the sound of little feet. By September 1836, his silence broke in a different way. He brought a physician from Augusta to examine her. A man who stayed 3 days at the plantation and subjected her to procedures Catherine later wrote were humiliations beyond anything she could describe. His conclusion, delivered privately to Nathaniel while she sat alone in the parlor, was devastating. Some defect in her womb meant she would never bear children. The language was clinical, almost foreign to her ears, but the meaning was inescapable. Her role as wife, mother, and mistress of Sweetwater had ended before it had even begun. Nathaniel's response was not the anger she feared. Instead, he grew disturbingly calm, thanked the doctor, paid him handsomely, and sent him back to Augusta. That night over dinner, he explained that he had been studying, corresponding with men in Charleston who called their work natural philosophy, the so-called science of heredity and breeding. If Catherine could not give him an heir, he told her there were other methods. Legal methods. Practices already common across the South, though rarely spoken of in polite company. Catherine knew immediately what he meant. She had heard the whispers. Planters who fathered children through enslaved women to expand their labor force without purchasing more slaves. By law, those children were born into bondage, inheriting their mother's status. Some men kept such arrangements hidden. Others flaunted them. But Nathaniel's vision was something colder, more deliberate. He did not simply intend to use enslaved women for heirs and profit. He wanted Catherine involved, wanted her present with pen in hand, documenting every detail. The first woman he chose was Ruth, 23 years old, tall and broad-shouldered from years of field labor. On a freezing January night in 1837, Nathaniel had her brought to a room on the east side of the house, a former linen closet he had repurposed for his scheme. He ordered Catherine to sit in the corner, record Ruth's health appearance and demeanor, while he carried out what he called the beginning of an experiment. Catherine's diary described that night in a single trembling passage. "God forgive me, I obeyed. I wrote as he commanded, while my husband stripped away my dignity and Ruth's humanity." She never cried out. That silence was worse than any scream. As the weeks unfolded, Catherine realized Nathaniel's intentions ran deeper than she feared. His journals overflowed with clippings from agricultural papers and letters from doctors who claimed people like livestock could be improved by pairing the strong with the strong, the intelligent with the intelligent. It was pseudoscience that would later become the backbone of slavery's darkest rationalizations. For Nathaniel, it was his project, his legacy. By spring, Baldwin County bloomed early, the dogwoods shedding white petals like snow across the red clay. Catherine walked the plantation grounds one morning in March. Her boots crushing blossoms, searching for peace in the quiet woods, because none remained within Sweetwater's walls. Ruth was with child. Catherine was the one who confirmed Ruth's condition, recognizing in another woman's body the signs she had once prayed to see in her own. When she told Nathaniel, he showed no tenderness, only the satisfaction of a man recording the progress of an experiment. He opened a new leather-bound ledger. One Catherine noticed looked nothing like the plantation's account books. Its pages were divided into columns, with headings that made her blood run cold. Physical traits estimated intelligence, projected market value, temperament, breeding potential. Ruth's name was only the first entry. In April, Nathaniel chose Grace, barely 19. In May, it was Dinah from the kitchen. Each time, Catherine was forced to sit in the corner with pen and ink, noting details, while she willed her mind to retreat. She survived by focusing on anything but the act itself. The crack in the plaster wall, the faint hum of insects outside, the sour, sweet smell of oil lamps burning down. But no distraction could block out the weight of what was happening. Everyone at Sweetwater knew. The chosen women worked with hollow eyes, their silence heavier than words. Husbands, brothers, and fathers carried their fury deep in their chests, knowing that even a whispered protest could mean the whip, the auction block, or worse. The plantation's air grew heavier with each passing day. Work still carried on, cotton still filled wagons, but beneath the surface ran a current of fear and despair that warped every rhythm of life. Then in July, everything shifted again. A visitor arrived who would give Nathaniel's obsession a new, more dangerous shape. Cornelius Harrove came up the long oak-lined drive in a dust-covered carriage. A man in his 50s with a thick belly, heavy whiskers, and the soft hands of someone who had never truly practiced medicine. He claimed affiliation with the Medical Society of South Carolina, though Catherine later discovered his credentials were as shaky as his theories. Over dinner that first night, he introduced himself as a specialist in what he called anthropological medicine, the study of race and heredity. Nathaniel had been corresponding with him for months, ever since he'd read one of Harrow's articles in a Charleston medical journal. The piece with its pompous title, Observations on the Hereditary Transmission of Physical and Mental Characteristics in the Negro Race, argued that through careful selection, planters could cultivate stronger, more profitable generations of enslaved people. It was pseudoscience wrapped in polished language, welcomed in certain circles as forward-thinking published in journals that lent it legitimacy and whispered about in parlors where men fancied themselves enlightened. Harrow remained at Sweetwater for 3 weeks that summer. He examined every enslaved person on the estate, pulling out brass calipers to measure skulls, noting the curl of hair, the breadth of noses, the color of eyes. He asked questions that mocked the very idea of humanity, meant to gauge intelligence or obedience. Then scribbled his conclusions in clinical jargon that turned people into data. Catherine was made to assist, holding his tools, copying down numbers into the ledger he carried with him, listening as he reduced children to predictions about their future utility. His fascination with the youngest was the worst, measuring tiny arms and legs, pronouncing futures as if they were harvest forecasts. At night, Harrow and Nathaniel locked themselves in the study, their voices low and urgent. Catherine leaned against the door to catch fragments and soon realized their ambitions stretched far beyond Sweetwater. Harrow boasted of other planters who shared his vision, men who believed the South's prosperity lay in treating human lives as breeding stock. With shared records and cooperation, he said they could establish a network. Children with desirable traits could be exchanged like seed corn bloodlines, strengthened profits multiplied. It was Ruth, heavy with Nathaniel's child, who whispered to Catherine about what else was happening, something even more chilling. The thing that proved worse than the breeding itself revealed itself in late August when Ruth, 4 months along and trembling, slipped into Catherine's morning room and whispered what she'd been too afraid to say aloud. Babies born at Sweetwater were taken away at night, told to their mothers they were being sold and never seen again, hauled off in wagons with no destination given, maybe 20, maybe 25 over the years. Some taken long before Nathaniel died, and the disappearances growing since Dr. Harrow began visiting. The confession made Catherine's stomach drop because she had glimpsed the ledger Nathaniel kept. The leather-bound book with columns for physical traits, estimated intelligence, projected value, temperament, and breeding potential. And she understood in a flash that this was not merely about increasing labor, but about treating children as merchandise in a calculated program. When Nathaniel returned from Millville and Catherine confronted him, it was the only time she openly challenged him. He answered not with argument, but with a backhand that split her lip and a threat so cold it froze her blood, telling her she was complicit, that her records were essential, that one word from him to a judge friend would see her locked away in the Georgia lunatic asylum and branded mad for life. And in the silence that followed, something in Catherine snapped. The summer storms of 1837 hammered the Piedmont. The cotton rotted in fields, and planters worried in courthouse chambers, while Nathaniel kept his count and his experiments regardless of weather. In September, Grace gave birth to a pale-eyed boy. Harrow examined like a specimen, and Nathaniel praised as proof the project worked, and within a week, men came at night again to load a bundle into a covered wagon and drive south, while Grace, bound and hollowed by what had been taken from her, was returned to the rows to labor. Catherine began keeping a secret diary, a ledger of another kind, writing names, birth dates, who disappeared, trying to see patterns, and she turned to the herb garden she had once tended for comfort with a new grim purpose, rereading her mother's books on remedies and studying plants with cumulative properties. Foxglove among them, which in small doses could strengthen a failing heart, but in repeated measured doses could bring weakness, confusion, and slow decline, an untraceable undoing. By October, Ruth gave birth to a darker-skinned girl, and Nathaniel was plainly disappointed, his plans favoring the lighter-eyed infants Harrove coveted, while Catherine, wounded and watched, learned to live inside a double life outwardly. The obedient mistress taking notes, inwardly a woman knitting together evidence and a patient, dangerous resolve to make the ledger he loved a record of his own undoing. Harrove studied the newborn carefully, his pen scratching across the page as he noted the child's features and dismissed her as less useful to their design. No wagon came in the night for this one. She stayed with Ruth, given the name Martha, and Catherine felt an almost shameful surge of relief that at least this baby would remain with her mother, even if it meant a life bound in chains at Sweetwater. The reprieve did not last. In November, Dinah went into labor and everything unraveled. The baby boy was stillborn, and Dinah herself hemorrhaged. Catherine tried desperately to save her using every bit of knowledge she had. But 3 days later, Dinah was gone. Catherine scrubbed the blood herself, hands trembling, fighting back nausea and grief. She had been forced to watch the violation, to write it down, and now she was left with the stain of the aftermath. The guilt nearly broke her. She vomited into a bucket in the laundry room, then smoothed her face into composure, because at Sweetwater, even sorrow had no place. Nathaniel treated Dinah's death as a loss in a ledger more inconvenience than tragedy. He marked it down as a complication to be avoided in future selections. Harrove wanted to dissect the body for insight, but Nathaniel denied him, not out of respect, but out of calculation. Too much disrespect toward the dead could fracture morale among the enslaved. So Dinah was laid to rest in the rough cemetery behind the quarters beneath wooden crosses and stones. Catherine stood apart while the community gathered hymns, low and mournful. Ruth clutching Martha Grace, staring hollow-eyed, the men's fists clenched in mute fury. Catherine could feel their hatred aimed at her as much as at Nathaniel, and she did not resist it. She was guilty, but she was also preparing. Each week she gathered foxglove leaves, dried them, ground them into powder. Tiny doses went into Nathaniel's whiskey, not enough to raise suspicion, only enough to slowly drain him. She told herself it was justice, but deep down she knew it was something darker. Vengeance born of rage, grief, and the unbearable weight of complicity. By December, the frost had killed her garden, and she tucked away the last foxglove seeds for spring. Patience had become her weapon. Revenge was not an outburst. It was a campaign, and she had nothing left but time. Harrove returned for Christmas, bringing papers he and Nathaniel locked themselves away to study. Catherine imagined the web they were weaving, other plantations, other men, children traded like livestock in the name of science. On Christmas Eve, the enslaved people held their small celebrations, singing in the quarters as best they could. Catherine watched from the house window as Ruth swayed with Martha in her arms. Grace stood silent on the edge, and for the first time, Catherine turned away without breaking. She poured herself wine, her hand steady, her heart colder. When the new year of 1838 came, rain froze the roads to mud and confined them all. Nathaniel's health was fading. Fatigue, nausea, that vague winter weakness he never thought worth a doctor's visit. Catherine smiled at him across the table, poured his coffee with careful hands, and watched him drink the poison, doing its quiet work. March came with a false spring, and with it, Nathaniel's steady decline. Nathaniel lowered his fork slowly, the lamplight catching in his pale eyes, and for a long moment, Catherine thought he might strike her again. Instead, he set the utensil neatly beside his plate and dabbed his mouth with his napkin, every movement deliberate. "Servants talk too much," he said in that calm, measured tone he used when rage was simmering beneath the surface. "And you would do well not to listen." Catherine forced a smile, pretending to let the matter drop. but inside her pulse thundered. The rumors Pearl had revealed were true. Nathaniel's reaction confirmed it. Somewhere on the plantation, hidden from her for nearly a decade, there was a boy who was both son and experiment heir and prisoner. Over the following days, Catherine grew more determined to see Samuel for herself. She watched Nathaniel's routines with sharper attention, noting when he slipped away toward the eastern side of the property in the afternoons. Each time he returned, there was a peculiar satisfaction in his expression, the kind of pride a tutor might wear after a lesson with a gifted pupil. Catherine knew then that Pearl had not exaggerated. Samuel was being trained, groomed, molded into something Nathaniel believed would prove his theories to the world. The knowledge gnawed at her. It was one thing to watch Nathaniel's grotesque ledger of women and infants, another to realize he had already built his proof into a living child. 8 years of shaping of books and lessons of bending a boy into the image of his own obsession. Samuel wasn't just a secret, he was the cornerstone of Nathaniel's legacy. Catherine's resolve hardened. If Nathaniel meant to make Samuel the future of Sweetwater's breeding project, then Samuel was also the key to undoing it. But Catherine was cautious. She did not rush. She maintained her mask at the breakfast table, poured Nathaniel's coffee with steady hands, and continued slipping foxglove into his evening whiskey. She smiled when he complained of weakness and asked if perhaps he should rest more, all the while planning her own steps. She would see the boy. She would learn who Samuel really was, not just Nathaniel's creation, but a child old enough to think, to feel, to choose his own path. And if Pearl was right, if Samuel's eyes carried anger and awareness, then maybe Catherine was not the only one inside Sweetwater, quietly waiting for the right moment to strike back. Nathaniel's words replayed in Catherine's mind long after they had returned from the cabin. The boy's face, so strikingly like Nathaniel's, yet so carefully molded into something beyond his years, haunted her. Samuel had bowed, spoken with perfect diction, answered every question with precision. But his eyes, those gray eyes, had held something Nathaniel either could not or would not see. They were not obedient. They were watching, weighing, waiting. Back in her chambers, Catherine sat at her desk with her diary, open, pen poised. But for once, she could not force words onto the page. The reality of Nathaniel's plan had rooted itself too deeply in her chest. It was one thing to document the endless cycle of forced breeding, the disappearances, the ledgers filled with measurements and values. It was another to realize Nathaniel had cultivated a child into the living embodiment of his twisted theories, and now intended to reduce him further, to use his own flesh and blood as breeding stock in the name of progress. She tried to imagine what 8 years of such instruction had done to Samuel, what it meant to be raised not as a son, but as an experiment. The boy's posture, his tone, the way he never once faltered under Nathaniel's gaze. Was that discipline or defiance buried deep? Pearl had said he was angry, that he knew what he was. If that was true, then Samuel carried not only Nathaniel's blood, but the potential to undo him. Catherine closed the diary without writing a line. For the first time, she felt that her role as observer and secret chronicler might not be enough. Poisoning Nathaniel slowly was one kind of justice. But Samuel's existence opened another path, one Nathaniel had never considered. If the boy saw the truth, if he understood the depth of his father's corruption, then perhaps the legacy Nathaniel meant to build could be shattered from within. But such a possibility was dangerous. Samuel was watched, shaped, manipulated daily. One wrong step, one whisper of rebellion, and Nathaniel would crush him as coldly as he had threatened to crush her. Catherine lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling beams above her bed, wondering if she dared reach out to Samuel in secret. Wondering if she could risk giving him the truth that he was not a tool, not a specimen, not property, but a human being who could choose his own fate. For the first time since her marriage began, Catherine felt the stirrings of something beyond fear and vengeance. She felt the faintest trace of hope, and hope she realized might be the most dangerous thing of all at Sweetwater Plantation. Pearl's labor came quickly, her cries echoing through the main house corridors until Catherine rushed to her side. By then, Catherine had attended enough births to know the rhythm of pain and progress. But Pearl's was different, fierce, urgent, as if her body was fighting not just for the child, but for something larger. Hours later, with sweat slicking her brow and her knuckles white against the sheets, Pearl delivered a boy. His skin was light, his features already sharp, his eyes an uncertain color that would settle in weeks to come. Catherine wrapped the newborn and handed him to Pearl, who clutched him with trembling arms, her face raw with exhaustion, but lit with a defiance Catherine had rarely seen in her before. Nathaniel was not present for the birth. He was too weak to leave his chambers, but Harrove was. He took notes with his usual clinical detachment, measuring, observing, speaking of potential, as if the infant were a specimen and not a child. "Exceptional," he muttered, scribbling into his ledger. "Yes, very promising." Pearl turned her head away, tears slipping silently down her face. That night, Catherine sat alone in a room candle burning low, her diary open. She recorded the facts, date, name, details, but her hand shook. The child in Pearl's arms was not just another entry in Nathaniel's experiment. He was another Samuel in the making. Another piece of proof for Harrove's so-called science. Another life they planned to twist into property and legacy. Catherine felt the weight of it crushing down on her. She thought of Reverend Gaines. Thought of his careful sermons, his measured words about compassion and duty. The way he looked at the enslaved, not as resources, but as people. He was not a revolutionary. He was too cautious, too bound by his position. But he was a beginning, a man who could carry truth beyond Sweetwater's walls. For the first time, Catherine allowed herself to consider something beyond her secret ledger or her slow campaign of poison. Perhaps she could enlist him not only as a confessor, but as a witness. Someone who could say what she could not, someone who could give voice to the silence she had been forced to keep. But the risk was staggering. If Nathaniel discovered even the hint of collusion, her fate was sealed. And Brave Pearl would pay too. Catherine closed the diary without finishing her entry, the ink smearing as her hand trembled. The storm she had long been waiting for was building, and she knew the next move could not be hers alone. It would have to be Samuel's, or Pearl's, or perhaps the Reverend's. But soon something would break at Sweetwater. And when it did, Catherine swore she would be ready. When Reverend Gaines returned to Sweetwater, unannounced that Thursday, his face told Catherine something had shifted. After Pearl left the parlor, he spoke quietly that his inquiries in Savannah and Charleston had uncovered patterns pointing to an organized network, not isolated cruelty. And when he asked her directly if children were being bred and shipped from Sweetwater, she could no longer dance around it. She told him everything plainly, that Nathaniel and a Charleston doctor named Harrove had been running a breeding experiment, that Nathaniel fathered children with enslaved women, that infants with certain traits were taken at night and funneled through a man named Edmund Calloway to buyers far south, and that she had kept a private record with names, dates, and descriptions documenting roughly 40 disappearances over the past decade. The minister went pale, and for the first time, the terrible arithmetic Catherine had kept on paper had a chance to become someone else's burden to carry. This admission was the culmination of months of stealth and small rebellions, the point where her secret poison, her ledger, and the clandestine ally she had cultivated might actually meet a force with reach beyond Baldwin County. Nathaniel, weakened by illness and steady erosion, could still try to silence her. But Reverend Gaines brought a different kind of danger for him. Moral authority and connections that might make a legal or public challenge possible in ways a planter could not so easily dismiss. Pearl's baby Grace remained in limbo, Ruth and Martha, and the others still living with the daily violence of Sweetwater and Samuel Nathaniel's hidden son waited in his cabin. Watched and taught and shaped for a future Catherine now saw she had to prevent. Catherine had offered Nathaniel a bargain before demanding that no more women be chosen and that Pearl's child stay, and now with the minister listening, she had moved from private resistance to a desperate outward strategy. The risk was immense, the consequences terrifying. But for the first time, Catherine felt less like a lone witness and more like someone with a plan that might have timed right and carried by the right allies. Break the ledger, break the network, and stop the cycle before it could claim another generation. Catherine froze the basket of herbs still in her hands as the sound of shouting rolled across the yard. It wasn't the everyday noise of plantation life, the calls to work, the clatter of tools, but a sharper, panicked sound, voices raised in alarm and fear. She set the basket down and ran toward the quarters, her skirts catching on the damp grass. A knot of people had gathered near Pearl's cabin. The men stood tense and watchful. The women clutched children to their skirts. Catherine pushed through to the front, her heart hammering. Samuel was there, pale but upright, his small fists clenched at his sides. One of the overseers, a wiry man Nathaniel had brought in to manage the fields while his health faltered, was gripping Ruth by the arm, shaking her hard enough to make her head snap back. "She's hiding something," he barked. "Letters, papers. I saw the boy near her cabin." Ruth said nothing, but Catherine saw the terror in her eyes. Not terror for herself, terror for Samuel. Nathaniel's suspicion had moved beyond Catherine. It was now spreading toward the enslaved people, toward Pearl and Ruth, toward the fragile web of secrecy Catherine had built. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice cutting across the noise. The overseer looked startled for a moment, unused to her tone. "You will release her at once," she said, drawing on every ounce of authority her position still afforded. "No one here is to be handled without my husband's express order." The man hesitated, then let go of Ruth. She stumbled but caught herself holding her head high. Catherine saw Samuel's eyes flicker to hers for a brief moment, an unspoken question, a silent warning. Nathaniel was nowhere to be seen. He had been staying in his room more and more, too weak to oversee everything. But Catherine knew the reprieve would not last. If he caught even a whiff of Samuel's role as a messenger, the boy would be lost. She turned on the overseer, her voice like iron. "I will handle this matter personally. Return to your work." The man muttered, but stepped back and the crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring. Catherine helped Ruth to her cabin, Pearl following close behind, with baby Grace pressed to her chest. Inside the small, dim room, Catherine shut the door and turned to the women. "We have very little time," she said quietly. "Nathaniel suspects. The overseers are watching. If we are to finish what we've started, we must be ready." Pearl's face was pale, but steady. The Reverend— "He has the documents now," Catherine said. "Enough to act if he can find someone willing to act." Samuel appeared in the doorway, silent as a shadow. He held another folded note, his handwriting neat and deliberate. "He's asking what to do next." Pearl translated in a low voice. "He says he's ready." Catherine took the paper and closed her eyes. The weight of it was almost unbearable. An 8-year-old boy was risking everything, carrying their hopes on small shoulders. She thought of Nathaniel's plans for him to turn him into a living instrument of the experiment and felt something cold and sharp settle inside her. "Tell him to wait," she said finally. "Tell him we're almost ready. But he must be careful, more careful than ever." Outside, the autumn wind rattled the dry leaves. The frost would come soon, and with it Catherine knew the breaking point. Sweetwater Plantation was holding its breath, and so was she. Nathaniel's hand, still clutching the incriminating paper, trembled as his face drained from rage to something more like shock. The overseer's hoofbeats faded toward the stable. For the first time, Catherine saw uncertainty flicker in his gray eyes. He opened his mouth, but no words came. She stepped closer, closing the space between them, until only he could hear her. "You taught me to document, Nathaniel. You taught me patience, precision. Did you truly think I was doing it for you? Every birth, every sale, every night wagon leaving this plantation, it's all there. Copied, sent away. Even if you have me dragged off to the asylum tonight by tomorrow, your name will be ash in the papers from Charleston to Atlanta." Nathaniel swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the paper until it crumpled. Behind them, the enslaved people watched silently, Pearl clutching baby Grace to her chest. Samuel still on his knees, his lip bleeding but his eyes burning. Ruth stood in her doorway, Martha pressed to her skirts, every face taut with expectation. "Where are the originals?" Nathaniel demanded, his voice low but shaking. Catherine kept her voice level, quiet enough that only he could hear safe. "Beyond your reach. And there are copies with names attached, respectable names. If I disappear, they will go everywhere. You will lose everything. And worse, people you consider your allies will see their own names exposed. Do you want that, Nathaniel?" For a long moment, only the wind moved across the yard, carrying the dry smell of cotton and frost. Nathaniel's grip on the paper loosened. He glanced at Samuel, then at Pearl, then back at Catherine. He was sick, weakening. His hand shook as he rubbed his temple. The weight of his calculations, decades of work, the network, the secrecy was collapsing under the single fact that Catherine had outmaneuvered him. "You think you've trapped me?" he said finally, voice a rasp. "I don't have to trap you," Catherine replied softly. "You've done that to yourself. I'm offering you a choice. Stop. Leave the women alone. Leave the children with their mothers. If you don't, your name and Harrow's and Calloway's will be dragged through courts and newspapers until there is nothing left but disgrace. You know I have the proof." She could see him measuring the truth of it, just as she had measured his experiments for years. His chest rose and fell, shallow and uneven. The overseer's horse was a fading dot on the horizon. Dr. Phillips would still come unless Nathaniel countermanded the order. This was the moment. Catherine glanced down at Samuel, whose eyes were locked on hers, steady and defiant. Pearl tightened her hold on the baby, a flicker of hope crossing her face. Catherine took a single step closer, her voice now a whisper. "Decide, Nathaniel. Right here, right now. Because if you send me to that asylum, everything you built ends with me, and you will not control the ruin." He stared at her, and for the first time since their marriage began, Catherine saw something like fear looking back. The yard was utterly silent, except for the faint cry of a baby somewhere in the distance. Catherine stood in the center of it, her skirts damp with dew. Her heart still pounding as if she had run miles. Around her were the faces of people who had been forced to bow and whisper for their entire lives. Faces now lifted, watching, remembering. Pearl held Grace a little tighter, her chin raised. Ruth's hand rested protectively on Martha's shoulder. Samuel wiped the blood from his lip and stood taller than his 8 years, his eyes fixed on Catherine with a fierce, steady light that looked nothing like defeat. Catherine understood in that moment that something irreversible had happened at Sweetwater. Nathaniel had not been destroyed. He was still alive, still dangerous, still the master of the estate. But the unbroken control he had wielded over every life here had cracked. The enslaved had seen him hesitate. They had seen him forced to make concessions. They had seen Catherine, the mistress of the house, stand openly against him. The old order had been shaken in a way that no ledger, no poison, no hidden diary alone could accomplish. She also understood the cost. Nathaniel would make good on his threat to make her life inside the house a slow punishment. He would twist every day into an exercise in humiliation, into a reminder that she was still bound to him by law and circumstance. But she had stopped the breeding program. She had won that much, and in doing so, had opened a space of possibility, however narrow, for Ruth, for the children who would not be taken in the night. She turned to Samuel. He was breathing evenly now, but his fists were still clenched at his sides. "You were brave," she said softly. "Too brave for a child to need to be. I am sorry for the position I put you in." "I wanted to help," Samuel said. "I know what he planned for me. I know what I was supposed to become." His voice, still high, but carrying a weight far older than his years, trembled only slightly. "I will not be what he wanted. I will not continue this. I promise you that." Catherine felt a lump rise in her throat. She nodded, unable to speak, and laid a hand briefly on his shoulder. For a moment the boy's mask slipped, and she saw something fierce, but also hopeful flicker there, the possibility of a future Nathaniel could not control. Then she looked around the yard one last time. Pearl met her gaze and inclined her head, a silent acknowledgement that they were no longer merely victims, but participants in a fragile, dangerous alliance. Ruth lifted Martha and stepped closer, as if to form a small, unspoken circle around Catherine. They had all witnessed what had just transpired. The story of it would pass from cabin to cabin that night, whispered over cooking fires, shaping itself into something bigger than the moment. Catherine drew a breath, straightened her back, and said quietly, "Go back inside. All of you. He's watching from the window, and we must be careful now." The spell broke. The people dispersed slowly, not cowed but deliberate, their eyes still on her. Samuel slipped away toward his cabin without a word. As Catherine walked back to the main house alone, she knew Nathaniel's words were true. She had won a battle, not the war. She would still be trapped in Sweetwater, still complicit in its past. But she had cracked open the future. And in that narrow opening, Pearl's child in her mother's arms, Ruth's daughter still safe. Samuel's whispered promise she saw for the first time, the faint outline of redemption. Ruth and Martha sat at Catherine's bedside in the spring of 1854, the air heavy with the scent of lavender sachets and wood smoke. Catherine's cough had worsened, rattling her frail frame, but her mind remained sharp. She had organized her diary, her ledgers, and the documentation of Nathaniel's crimes into a sealed package with instructions to her lawyer: keep it hidden for 100 years, then let the truth speak. She wanted the world to know what had been done at Sweetwater, but not while the victims or their children still lived to suffer fresh wounds. Ruth sat quietly, her hand resting on Martha's, as the girl looked wide-eyed at the once formidable mistress of the plantation, now diminished by illness. There were no accusations in Ruth's eyes, no forgiveness either, only a weary understanding that trauma binds people in strange ways. Catherine whispered to Martha about learning to read, about holding fast to hope, about knowing that dignity existed even when others tried to strip it away. In those final days, Catherine felt the weight of everything she had done and everything she had failed to do. She had stopped Nathaniel's program, freed Pearl and Grace, given Samuel the chance to choose his own future. Yet she had also waited too long, allowed too much, remained complicit for months when action might have saved lives. That duality was her final truth, both betrayer and protector, victim and conspirator, destroyer and preserver. When she died in June 1854, she was buried beside Nathaniel in the family cemetery, though the two could not have been further apart in spirit. Sweetwater passed to distant relatives, the enslaved still bound until emancipation came a decade later. Samuel's descendants in Philadelphia would never know the full weight of their origins until scholars uncovered Catherine's sealed records nearly a century later, laying bare the nightmare of Sweetwater and the quiet, deadly resistance of the woman who had lived through it. The discovery of Catherine's papers in 1954 broke open a past that Baldwin County and much of the South had allowed to sink beneath weeds and silence. For a century, Sweetwater Plantation had been forgotten, erased by fire, by overgrown cemeteries, by the reluctance of white families to preserve records that implicated their own. But inside the courthouse box was a century's worth of ghosts, forced back into the light by Catherine's final act of preservation. Her diary spoke with a trembling but relentless hand, recounting night after night of observation, every birth, every disappearance. Nathaniel's ledgers stood beside it like a grotesque mirror, numbers and categories where Catherine had written cries of despair. Harrove and Calloway's letters revealed the larger web, a network of men in coats and ties who cloaked atrocity in academic language. And Pearl's scraps of testimony, carefully hidden and miraculously saved, gave voice to those Catherine had tried, however imperfectly, to defend. Dr. Margaret Fletcher's decision to publish those papers turned Sweetwater into something more than a ruin lost under kudzu. Her book, Sweetwater, a case study in scientific racism and domestic trafficking in antebellum Georgia, shocked readers not just because of what happened there, but because of what it implied that Sweetwater was not a singular nightmare, but one thread in a tapestry of organized cruelty stretching across the South. Catherine had hoped in her final instructions that the world would one day understand what had been done in those quiet fields along the Oconee. Fletcher ensured that wish was honored, though not without resistance. Descendants of the Brennans protested. Newspapers argued, historians debated whether Fletcher had overemphasized the extreme. But over time, other records emerged, similar experiments, similar disappearances, similar ledgers. Sweetwater was not an outlier. It was a case study in what slavery could become when ambition, pseudoscience, and human greed intersected. And so Catherine's whispered promise to Ruth that stopping it when she did mattered, even if too little and too late, was borne out in an unexpected way. She had not saved every child. She had not freed every woman. She had not broken the system in her own lifetime. But by preserving the truth, by leaving a record that could not be buried forever, she ensured that the silence would one day end and bend. The women of Sweetwater, Catherine, Ruth, Pearl, and those who could not speak for themselves, did enough to make sure history would not forget. And perhaps that in the long, cruel arc of time was their redemption. By the time Fletcher's book reached the public in the late 1950s, the ripples of Sweetwater's legacy spread far beyond Baldwin County. Samuel's grandson, Dr. Robert Cunningham, a respected physician in Philadelphia, read the case study and realized at last why his grandfather had lived with such unspoken sorrow. Samuel had built a new life under an assumed name, but the shadow of Sweetwater had never left him. Robert wrote to Fletcher thanking her for honoring the truth and provided family records that helped fill in the missing pieces of Samuel's story after he left Georgia. Pearl's granddaughter, a teacher in Boston, also reached out. She shared fragments of oral history stories Pearl had whispered about Catherine's defiance, about secret notes passed in books, about the fragile threads of resistance that allowed enslaved people to endure. These family memories, layered with the written documents, gave historians a fuller picture of how people survived inside one of the darkest corners of slavery. Ruth's descendants proved more elusive. Martha had married and stayed in Georgia. Her children later swept into the Great Migration north. Some evidence pointed to a great-granddaughter in Detroit in the 1970s, but the connection was never proven. Grace left no line at all. She died of pneumonia in 1862, still enslaved, her name surviving only in Catherine's diary, 47 entries that chronicled her silence, her pain, her hollowed-out existence. Grace stands for the countless women whose suffering left no official trace, remembered only in the margins of other people's stories. Sweetwater forces us to face the uncomfortable truth that slavery was not just whips and chains. but ledgers, medical instruments, scientific jargon, and men who convinced themselves that atrocity was progress. It shows how evil can wear the mask of order, how meticulous records and polite letters can conceal trafficking, rape, and generations of human theft. It also shows the narrow margins of resistance, how a woman like Catherine, complicit for too long, could still use her position to preserve evidence, to halt the worst of the horrors, and to ensure that someday the truth would surface. She was no saint. She waited. She enabled. But she also acted in the end, with enough resolve to save lives and enough foresight to leave behind a record that history could not erase. Today, Sweetwater exists only in fragments. The land has been divided, much of it absorbed into Oconee National Forest. The main house is gone, the quarters dismantled, and the cemetery nearly hidden by kudzu, its stones split and illegible. Hikers stumble across it sometimes, without knowing the stories beneath their feet. But in archives and family memories, and in Fletcher's book, Sweetwater endures as both a warning and a testament that truth, though buried, has a way of clawing back to the surface, and that even in a world built on silence, someone was writing it all down. The stone foundation of Sweetwater's great house still lies beneath the vines, if you know where to look, swallowed by kudzu and Virginia creeper. There is no marker here, no memorial to the women who were violated, the children stolen, the lives consumed by Nathaniel Brennan's experiments and Catherine's late defiance. Sweetwater has been forgotten by almost everyone, except a handful of scholars who study the darkest corners of slavery's history. But the documents remain. Preserved in the University of Georgia's special collections, they continue to confront researchers and students with evidence of what human cruelty looks like when it hides behind law, profit, and pseudoscience. Samuel's story, Pearl's story, Ruth's story, and Catherine's story live on, disturbing and imperfect but necessary. Because forgetting would be far worse than remembering. This is not a ghost story. It is something more terrifying, a true story about what people will do to each other when the systems of power allow it, reward it, and excuse it. The horror of Sweetwater is not that it belongs to some distant, unimaginable past. It is that it unfolded within the lifetimes of people whose grandchildren are still alive today. The greater horror is how easily such things can be buried, minimized, or explained away. How tempting it is to look away from what makes us uncomfortable. But these stories remind us that silence is complicity and forgetting is dangerous. What do you think? Could Catherine have done more? Should we judge her by the standards of her time, or by universal truths she must have known were wrong? How do we reckon with the fact that so many people profited from systems they knew were built on suffering? There are no easy answers, but they are questions we must keep asking. Because only by facing what really happened can we hope to stop it from happening again. If this investigation into America's hidden history has moved you, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and ring that bell so you don't miss the next journey into the past's darkest corners. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments how it struck you. Your voices add to the record we are still building together. These stories are painful, but they are essential. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next chapter of America's Forgotten History.